In this tutorial, we're going to look at how Forest Pack's various area modes can be used to populate scenes with realistic foliage in a matter of minutes. Using these techniques, you'll be able to create nature renders in little more than an afternoon. A few caveats. For this scene, all the plant models were from libraries. Modelling and texturing foliage is a specialised and lengthy task that's beyond the scope of this video. The house you see in the scene has also already been supplied, but everything else you can build from scratch. If you'd like to follow along, a starter file is available that contains the landscape and the building. You'll just need to source your own plant models. The majority of the tutorial can be completed using the included assets that come free with Forest Pack and Railclone, but the final image did supplement these with a few extra heather models from 3D Mentor and a bush and additional grasses from Evermotion. To get started, we'll model the landscape. You can do this with simple planes and use poly modelling techniques in combination with the turbosmooth modifier to rough out the terrain. This approach has two key benefits. First of all, if you retain the low poly version, it's very easy to modify the landscape by moving just a few vertices. And secondly, by maintaining good edge flow, you can easily extract splines to be used with Forest Pack. In this scene, we created 5 large planes to define the foreground, midground, lake, background and far background. Just a note here that to sculpt a landscape quickly from the camera's point of view, a neat trick is to start by adding edges that run from left to right, and then use 3ds Max's Paint Connect tool to add perpendicular edge loops that define footpaths, hills and any other features that lead the eye through the image. Once you've created these edges, an easy way to make bold changes to the landscape's topography is using Meow's Spline Deformer script. This tool works by creating a simplified spline based on an edge selection that can then be used to warp the geometry. Later on, when we scatter items on the paths, we'll need splines that run down their centre. Thanks to the fact that we poly-modelled the terrain, it should have a decent edge flow that will make the splines very easy to create. Just select an edge loop from the middle of each footpath and click on the Create Shape option in the Edit Poly modifier. Choose linear mode so that the spline will match the terrain's topography perfectly. And follow the same procedure to create any other splines that would be helpful to control scatters later. You can't have too many options. To add some interest and more detail to the area around the building, we'll create fences using Railclone's built-in library. Draw a spline in the top viewport curving from the front of the building across the midground of the camera view. This defines the centre of a road. Next, create a new Railclone object and open the library browser. Load the Post and Rail 1 preset. Assign the spline to the fence path parameter found in the base object's rollout. Now in the parameters rollout, you'll find several properties that allow you to adjust the height of the fence, the distance between the rails, the spacing between the posts and more. This fence style doesn't have a built-in ability to follow a surface, but fortunately Railclone presets are simple to edit. Open the Style Editor by clicking the button in the Style rollout. Add a new surface node to the graph and wire it to the 2 generators' surface inputs. Select the surface node, go to the Properties panel and assign the terrain to the object property. The fence will now deform to follow the landscape. Change both generators' Y offset values to move the fence to the side of the path. Finally, select the L1S generator and enable Rules Evenly Sync Offset so that the posts and the rails align correctly after they've been offset. Let's add some more detail to these houses. In the scene there are already closed splines to define the pitches of the roofs. We can use these with another built-in Railclone preset to quickly add roof tiles to the building. To do this, create a new Railclone object and load the Regent Tile preset from the library. Go to the base object's rollout and assign the roof spline to the clipping spline property. And that's it, you've just added 3D roof tiles to all of the roofs. From the parameters rollout, you have options to enable or disable verges and choose from one of 20 material presets. To finish the roofs, we'll add ridges. Turn on vertex snapping and draw halves on the apex of the roofs, one for each ridge. Ensure that the splines are part of the same editable spline object so that you can create all the ridges in one go. Create another new Railclone object and then load a ridge style from the library. go to the spline properties in the base objects rollout and assign the paths you just created. The ridges are created, and now you can just adjust the materials, the Z offset, and the overhang on the edges from the parameters rollout. This landscape looks a bit homogeneous, so let's break it up with some rocky areas. To do this, select the foreground landscape and make a rough selection of the polygons where you'd like to add a rock face. Detach these as a copy to a new editable polygon object. Add a push modifier that we'll use later to move the polys behind the existing terrain surface. Assign a rock material that uses a triplanar map to avoid having to worry about UVWs, and then add a V-Ray displacement modifier and assign the rock material's displacement map to the text map slot. Next, increase the displacement amount until the rock face has the desired ruggedness, and then add a negative value to the push modifier so that the rocks don't protrude through the surface. Add an edit poly modifier between the push modifier and the V-Ray displacement modifier, and use 3ds Max's freeform tools to sculpt the rock surface so that it protrudes through the terrain surface. This technique gives you a lot of control on where the rocks will appear, and it's very easy to edit and art direct by just simply resculpting this rock layer. Now, we don't want plants to grow on these rocks, so we'll exclude them from these areas using closed splines. You have two options to create these: either draw them manually, or if you're using the latest versions of Max, you can use one of the lesser known features of the new Boolean tools to create splines procedurally. To do this, instance the foreground terrain and the rocks, and add them both as union operands to a Boolean compound object. Now simply add an edit spline modifier to the top of this stack, and splines will be magically created where the two surfaces intersect. And best of all, if we update the original rock layer, the splines will update as well. So now that the landscape meshes are finished, it's time to add the plants. It's useful to decide in advance which plants you're going to require and render them in a single scene under similar lighting conditions to the final image. In that way, you can make sure that the colours complement one another, and if the assets are from different sources, as these were, you can also check that the shaders look similar enough and adjust them if necessary. We'll start at the back with the distant trees, so create a new forest pack object by adding the background terrain to the surfaces list. Pick a couple of trees from the built-in forest pack library and choose a distribution map. Maps with a few gaps in, such as the recently added patches options, work well because they suggest small clearings in the woods. Change the number of trees using the density units property until the landscape is well covered. In the surfaces rollout, turn on altitude range limited and edit the bottom property to prevent the trees from ending up in the lake. For more precise control and flexibility, we'll create a separate forest pack object for the foreground and midground trees. So starting with a forest pack to which the trees have already been added, we'll include the terrain meshes to the surfaces rollout and disable surfaces in the areas rollout. This will hide all the trees so that we can use paint areas to place them precisely where they're needed. Click to add a new paint area, increase the size of your brush, and paint the trees onto the surfaces where you need them. Pay close attention to the position of the trees from the camera's perspective because they're important for framing the view of this house. Don't forget, for both of these objects, to disguise the fact that we're reusing the same one or two models, you should go to the transform rollout and enable randomize, rotation and scale. The default settings are fine for most situations, but you may want to experiment by editing the minimum and maximum scale and the XY rotation values. Randomizing transforms is an essential step to create variation for nearly every vegetation scatter, so make sure that you turn on these settings for all of the forest objects you create during this tutorial. If you load a preset rather than a 3D model from the library, then these values will already be set for you. And then next we'll use the same technique more or less to add bushes to the foreground, around the house and along the tree line in the background. So create a new forest pack object and either pick some bushes from the library, use third-party models imported into the scene, or maybe a combination of these two. Add the terrain models to the surfaces list. Turn surfaces off from the area's view and use the paint tools to draw bushes around the house and framing the view in the foreground. If the bushes are too large and obscuring the architecture, you can easily edit the minimum and the maximum random scale values to reduce the size. No matter how carefully you paint your trees and bushes, there comes a point when you need to tweak the composition by editing individual items. To do this, go to the Items Editor rollout and change the mode to Custom Edit. You can now move, rotate and scale individual items, for example to make final adjustments to make sure that the view of the house is framed correctly. You can also change the model used for each item to perfect the composition. For example, in the foreground I ended up only using a single lilac bush to avoid the bright colours stealing focus from the house. On this subject, as they are also important compositional elements, the painting technique was also used to carefully position the heather. These plants don't flower all at the same time, so I used a couple of models, one in bloom and the other mostly still green. Instead of randomly scattering these, which would create a sort of unpleasant visual noise, it's more realistic to create small groups of the same type of plant. This simulates the growth patterns found in nature, caused either by the propagation habits of plants, or the ways in which soil and environmental conditions can affect their growth rate. Forest Pack's clustering feature simulates this effect. So to use clusters, first group together the plants you want to be in the same cluster by assigning them the same colour ID in the geometry rollout. Then go to the distribution rollout and change the diversity mode to clusters. You can now use the size parameter to set the size of the clusters, roughness to change the shape of the clusters, blurry edge to gradually dissolve between adjacent clusters instead of seeing a hard border, and noise to introduce random plants. An item's probability value also affects the proportion of clusters, and adding disabled items in a separate cluster is a great trick for introducing gaps to the distribution for another layer of randomization. With the heather done, to add bracken and dead plants to the foreground, you can use a high level of scale randomization for maximum variation. In the final render, a minimum value of 50% and a maximum of 150% was used. A patchy distribution map is used to create clusters of dead plants instead of an even distribution. And most importantly, these plants would have been cleared from the paths, so add the splines that follow the centre of the path to the areas list. Change the mode of these splines to exclude and increase the thickness values until the paths are clear. Add the spline created earlier using the Boolean technique as an exclude area as well to remove items from the rocks. So we've mentioned this before, but the key to believable ground cover is to use several layers of plant types. So we'll add another species of tall grass in the foreground. But we don't want it growing on the same area of land as the heather. Fortunately, there's an easy solution. Create a new plant layer on the terrain using a patches distribution map. In the areas rollout, add a forest area and pick the heather forest pack object. This grass will now be removed from all the areas where the heather grows, and best of all, this is a live link. So if you adjust the heather layer, the grass will also update automatically. So the grass is removed from the heather, but it's on the pathways. To clear it from there, add the splines to the areas list and change the mode to exclude. This time, instead of using the thickness parameter to clear the paths, we'll use fall-off curves to remove them in a much more refined way. This technique gives us much more control over the scale and size of the plants. But first, to minimise the effect of the spline's thickness so that all the work is done by the fall-off feature, reduce the thickness size to something very small like a millimetre. Now, once you've done that, enable density fall-off and increase the exclude size so that it's roughly half the width of your largest path. Click Edit Curve to bring up the fall-off graph, and on the x-axis, the start represents the outside of the path and the end represents the centre of the path. Therefore, to create a distribution that removes plants in two strips either side of the path centre, you would create a graph that peaks at 100% at both ends and then dips to 0% in the middle. We have only one fall-off curve but two paths of different widths. Luckily, you can reduce the exclude effect for the smaller path by reducing the area's fall off effect property to about 50%. As well as being able to exclude items using another forest pack object, it's also possible to use them to include items, even though seemingly that option is greyed out. To illustrate this, we'll add tall grass and weeds just under the trees. So we'll start in the usual way by assigning the terrain as a surface, and then add a new forest area to the areas list. Add a density and optionally a scale fall off value. At this point there will be plants everywhere except under the trees, which is the opposite of what we want. So to fix this, all you need to do is to enable the invert curve checkbox. And then to bring the grass closer to the trunks of the tree, reduce the area's scale percentage value. You can still use this in conjunction with other include objects. For example, we can paint additional reeds along the edges of the shoreline to make the transition more natural, as well as some in the foreground to add just another layer of grass. If we're using presets in the library, you should be aware that there are often two types, large and detail. Large presets contain 50 cm to 1 meter patches of plants that are designed for filling big areas. So you can pick a couple of these, for example, to fill the remaining uncovered midground and foreground areas. Another type of area is mesh areas, which can be used to exclude items based on an object in the scene. It works by projecting the item down from above and creating a bitmap, so it can handle even very high poly objects. So to illustrate this, add the building as a mesh exclude area so that grass doesn't grow on its interior. Make sure you exclude items completely from the rocks and the path using the splines we created earlier. We're removing them completely this time because the patches are too large to use the fall off trick we looked at in the previous steps. Instead, what we'll do is use a detail preset just to add plants back only in those smaller areas. So today you have another new forest pack object, and you can match one of the corresponding detail presets to add grass to the middle of the paths. These presets contain individual plants, so they're ideal where intricate detail and control is needed. Add the terrain to the surfaces list, and add the footpath's splines as include areas and set the thickness value to match half the width of the widest path. Enable density fall off, entering the same value you used for the largest spline thickness for the include amount. And then open the graph editor and edit the curve so that you have the plants growing only on the outside and the center of the paths. So we're nearly there. Layering up several interconnected scatters in this way is the key to creating fast, believable environments that are easy to art direct. The final scene was created only using the techniques discussed in this tutorial to add background trees, foreground trees, bushes, heather, sticks and bracken, 3 types of grass, each in their own forest object, some small flowers, and then finally stones and more grass on the footsteps. Best of all, because all the forest pack objects are interconnected, it's really easy and enjoyable to update and experiment with a scene like this.